Some dare call it conspiracy.
And welcome back to Weekend Classics on Some Dare FM. Today, we are diving into one of Neil Sanders' solo albums, Herd Immunity.
Hello. As some people might know, I've been writing some articles about COVID and the UK government response and what I think has been going on in regards to the pandemic. And some of that's pretty different to the rest of the alternative media. I also appreciate that these articles are pretty long and people don't tend to like to read long articles. So I've read them for you. So you've got absolutely no excuse now. Anyway, this first article is called Did the UK Go for Herd Immunity? And it came out on July the 31st, 2021. Did the UK go for herd immunity? The UK government has strongly denied that it ever considered using the tactic of attaining natural herd immunity for the population as a method to deal with the COVID pandemic. Well, except for the many times that they did admit that this was exactly what they were planning and when they promoted the idea. Confused? It is confusing, mostly because the UK government has gone out of its way to handle the pandemic crisis in a rather unique manner, by saying they were doing one thing, following the science, when in fact they're doing the complete opposite.
So what is herd immunity? Well, in simple terms, this is when a large enough percentage of the population becomes immune to a disease. And this can occur naturally with some diseases, say when enough people contract a virus and develop defences against it. But herd immunity can also occur through vaccination programmes. Whichever, the point is to get enough people immune so that the virus has limited options to spread and eventually it dies out. The concept of developing natural herd immunity was particularly inviting to the current UK government because that specific route involved them doing nothing, sweet sod all, to stop the spread of the virus, whilst other countries were flailing about, closing borders, imposing methods to track the spread and advising citizens on the best course of action. Our government chose the option of saying, piss on all that for a game of soldiers. Why? Well, because their donors didn't want the economy, which translates to rich people's profit margins, affected. Johnson was only too happy to oblige. Rather quickly, it transpired that COVID was more contagious than previously thought and had more potential to harm huge swathes of the population, so the government sprang into action. Actually, no, they didn't. They pissed around for weeks and waited even longer. And when they did actually start to do something, it was all a facade, window dressing to give the vague impression of giving a solitary shit about anyone but themselves. But did they really go for herd immunity? Well, when you look at the UK government's response to the unfolding crisis, it becomes very clear that this was precisely what they intended. Here is a timeline of the events and the strikingly large amount of evidence that the UK government decided to conduct an experiment on the general public in an attempt to curry favour with their donors. This was an experiment that cost over 150,000 lives. On the 3rd of February 2020, Boris Johnson made a speech to the Tory party donors in which he said, "Global growth is itself anemic, and the decline in global poverty is beginning to slow," he said. And in that context, we're starting to hear some bizarre alt-Arctic rhetoric when barriers are going up and when there is a risk that new diseases such as coronavirus will trigger a panic and a desire for market segregation that goes beyond what is medically rational to the point of doing real and unnecessary economic damage. Then, at that moment, humanity needs some government somewhere that is willing at least to make the case powerfully for freedom of exchange. He went on to suggest that the UK would be that country, ready to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and leap into the phone booth and emerge with its cloak flowing as the supercharged champion. So, what Johnson's doing here is he's reassuring the party donors that he won't react to the COVID pandemic in the same way that other countries will. He will focus on protecting the economy over handling the disease. Remember, in this context, the economy is the profit margins of these very donors. Johnson actually saw this as an opportunity to placate these donors, feeling that other countries would probably overreact and that the UK's lax attitude could be used to capitalise on the situation. Also in February, it was revealed that government advisor Dominic Cummings had stated, "Herd immunity, protect the economy, and if that means that some pensioners die, Too bad. As reported in the Financial Times, the acceptance of the disease would inevitably spread widely across British society, but could be managed, meant that Britain did not immediately announce tough social distancing measures and had a limited testing regime. Dominic supported the policy 100%, said one Downing Street official. By this time, the UK government had moved 20,000 COVID patients into care homes to recover. COVID began to spread like wildfire in care homes. Strangely, the policy set out by the UK government insisted on not testing patients transferred to these care homes and also not providing adequate PPE for the care home staff. If a care home resident was suspected to have COVID, the plan was to quarantine everyone inside together, ensuring that all or most residents who were quarantined with them caught the disease. The lack of PPE was an ongoing concern during the crisis. In April, PPE stocks were so low that nurses were improvising by wearing cut-up bin bags. Billions of pounds in contracts were given to the friends of cabinet ministers, and most of these contracts reeked of corruption. As reported in the Financial Times. In a report released on Wednesday, the NAO highlighted contracts where the supplier had a close link to Whitehall. They included a £550,000 consulting deal with Public First, whose two directors previously worked for Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove, and a technology agreement worth about £1 million with Faculty, whose shareholders until recently included Theodore Agnew, another Cabinet Office Minister. The Cabinet Office failed to document any consideration of any potential conflict of interest and also failed to document why it chose this particular supplier when it awarded the contracts, the report said. In a third example, it said health department officials failed to consider a potential conflict of interest in a £252 million contract to supply PPE with Aanda Capital, a private investment firm. The deal was controversial because Aanda's board is advised by Andrew Mills, and at the time, Andrew Mills was an advisor to the Board of Trade. The watchdog also highlighted lucrative PPE contracts awarded outside of usual procurement methods, including a high priority lane for companies referred by government officials or ministers' officers, MPs or peers. Such companies were 10 times more likely to have obtained contracts than suppliers who pitched through ordinary channels. A person close to the report said there were no rules for using the high priority referral system, which meant that there was a risk of it being open to abuse or inconsistency. In one case, Pestfix, a pest control supplies company in Littlehampton, Sussex, was added to the high priority lane in error without a referral. This resulted in Pestfix, which has net assets of around £18,000, being awarded a contract to supply PPE worth £350 million to the NHS. The NAO report detailed a string of poor procurement practices, such as companies being granted work without a formal contract. In one case, a £3 million contract with the consultancy firm Deloitte to support the procurement of PPE was not signed until 4 months after the work had begun. The PPE that cost £252 million, awarded to a tax haven in Mauritius with connections to MP Liz Truss, was never used as it was not fit for purpose. The government also bought 400,000 surgical gowns from Turkey, which were also never used as they didn't meet safety standards. The galling thing is, it was known that they wouldn't meet these standards before the order was placed. The landlord of Health Secretary Matt Hancock's favourite pub somehow managed to get a £30 million contract to make test tubes, which is something that he had never done before. Tory donor James Dyson was given a huge contract to make ventilators, something that he had never done before, as his primary field is vacuum cleaners. Actual ventilator manufacturers were turned down by the UK government. Anyway, I digress. Back to the timeline. By the 27th of February, Dominic Cummings and his mate Ben Warner of Vote Leave were advising the SAGE scientists on the strategy of achieving herd immunity. SAGE updated its assumptions for a reasonable worst-case scenario. It said that 80% of the UK population may become infected, with an overall 1% fatality rate in those infected. but it also added that only a proportion of those infected will experience symptoms. On the 3rd of March 2020, Boris Johnson proudly announced that he'd been into a hospital with COVID patients and he'd been shaking hands with everyone. On the 5th of March 2020, briefed by Number 10, Robert Peston of The Spectator, which is owned by Tory donors the Barclay brothers, revealed that the UK government strategy was to allow the virus to pass through the entire population. Also on March the 5th, Boris Johnson appeared on This Morning to tell Philip Schofield that one of the theories is that perhaps you could take it on the chin, take it all in one go. On the 5th of March, the Sage Minutes confirmed that the government decided to adopt this approach. The meeting during which this was cemented was attended by Dominic Cummings, Ben Warner and David Halpern, who is the head of the Cabinet Officer's Behavioural Insights team, which is also sometimes known as the Nudge Unit. In March 2020, before the first lockdown started, PR firm Topham Guerin was given a no-bid £3 million contract, which was paid by the taxpayer, to provide an information campaign for the UK public. What was the purpose of this campaign? Strangely, they encouraged people not to wear masks. The campaign was called Enjoy Summer Safely. It was tied into the Eat Out to Help Out campaign, and it spread the rumours communicated by the government that masks were not required, were ineffective, and could even cause the disease to spread further. This morphed into all sorts of nonsense and internet rumours claiming that masks trap the disease against your face, making you even more ill. And this was then expanded even further to include the utter made-up rubbish about masks causing hypoxia due to the reduced intake of oxygen. On the 11th of March, David Halpern of the Nudge Unit appeared on BBC Radio saying that the plan was to cocoon the vulnerable and allow the rest of the population to achieve herd immunity. Also on the 11th of March, which was the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, Jenny Harris, Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, said public outdoor events are safe and that we don't want to disrupt people's lives. That week, Liverpool played Atletico Madrid and 250,000 people went to the Cheltenham Festival. Matt Hancock mysteriously received a payment of £370,000 from the organisers of the Cheltenham Festival. By massive coincidence, Dido Harding, who oversaw the spending of £37 billion on a completely useless track and trace system, is married to a board member of the Jockey Club, who just so happen to be the owners of the Cheltenham Festival. Also on the 11th of March, Patrick Whitty announced that the government were not going to test anyone unless they were already in hospital. On March the 13th, Patrick Vallance, also of the Nudge Unit, appeared on TV to defend the government's herd immunity strategy. And on the same day, he appeared in the iNews newspaper proposing that herd immunity was the best strategy. Government advisor Nick Finn also appeared on Channel 4 to discuss herd immunity, saying, well, herd immunity is the situation where you get so many people in the population to develop an immunity to a disease, and there is no opportunity for the disease to actually become established and spread to lots of people. Normally, we would do that with a vaccine, he said. But you can do that naturally, of course, if a disease that's not been introduced before affects a large number of people, and that's really how herd immunity in the UK would develop. Also on the 13th of March, Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke to the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte and explained that the UK strategy was to achieve herd immunity. This was confirmed by the Italian Health Minister Pier Paolo Sileri. With lockdown looming, Boris Johnson refused to order the pubs to close. Instead, he advised them to close, but he gave no indication of what the coming plan might be or when, if they closed, they might be able to open up again. Fearing imminent closure, thousands flocked to their favourite watering holes. Lockdown started in the UK on the 23rd of March, and notes from the minutes of SAGE meetings show that herd immunity strategy was still in place until mid-April. A series of meeting minutes from this period show that SAGE belatedly conceded that there was no evidence pointing to high levels of population immunity in this stage of the pandemic, that it was unclear how long immunity lasted, and therefore the idea of opening up the economy via mass distributing of immunity passports for people recovered from the virus was premature. On the 24th of March, the Financial Times science editor Clive Cookson suggested that the country had already acquired substantial herd immunity through the unrecognised spread of COVID-19 over more than 2 months. If true, this would vindicate the government's unofficial herd immunity strategy, allowing the controlled spread of infection, he stated. Now, this was all based on a paper that had recently been released that suggested that half of the population of the UK was already immune to COVID, and therefore very little needed to be done to combat the spread. This became known as the Oxford paper, but strangely it didn't actually come from Oxford University, and it escaped the usual peer review process. The paper was authored in part by scientist Sunitra Gupta, and it strongly promoted herd immunity as a strategy. But this concept had also been promoted and presented by a group called Surgru Communications, who just so happened to be the PR arm of the UK's Nudge Unit, and they work with the MOD and the DSTL laboratory, among other people. The article in the FT stated, although some experts have shed doubt on the strength and length of the human immune response to the virus, Professor Gupta said that the emerging evidence made her confident that humanity would build up herd immunity against COVID-19. Sunitra Gupta would become a prominent voice in COVID denial, claiming, among other things, that we achieved this herd immunity as early as March 2020. Sunitra Gupta also received money directly from a donor to the Conservative Party, namely George von Opel, in return for promoting herd immunity. On April the 15th, the first anti-lockdown protest is held in Michigan, USA, and it transpires that this was arranged by Koch Industries, the DeVos family, and the Heritage Foundation. Simultaneously, there is a campaign called #FilmTheHospitals that is started by Council for National Policy member Jason Jones. All of these people are connected in some manner to the Conservative Party as donors. The anti-lockdown protests were billed as helping the working man, and this is patently ridiculous. Koch Industries have done more to lower the quality of the working man's life than almost any other institution. They haven't suddenly started caring. What they did was reduce the conversation to a binary position. You can stay at home and starve, or you can go to work and risk getting ill. Hence, they undermined the severity of symptoms and gave rise to this idea that COVID is just the flu. Why did they do this? Well, money. You see, there is another option. The government could do its fucking job. It could support people who can't work. It should provide cover for medical facilities that are overwhelmed. It could help people struggling mentally during the crisis. But all that's expensive, and it's a right pain in the arse, isn't it? And did I mention it's expensive? It's money, isn't it? All this costs money. And yeah, the attitude of the governments and the donors, it was, yeah, fuck you guys, where's my money? At the end of April, the oil industry shuddered as oil went into negative pricing, and this meant that the oil industry, for a time, was paying people to take their oil. Due to the slowing of international and domestic travel, the industry's profits were hit heavily, and this was for the first time in history that this happened. Why did this happen? Well, because people were isolating, not going to work, and not travelling internationally. And what does that have to do with anything? Well, did I mention that those donors, specifically and particularly those connected to the Kochs and the Heritage Foundation and the CNP, they're all in the oil, petrochemical and oil refinery business. I know this sounds pretty monstrous and also pretty monstrously simple, but in essence, the Tory donors wanted herd immunity as opposed to a slow measured response because they wanted people still using their products. They didn't want to lose money, and they definitely didn't want to spend any. Sage notes from May the 1st show that the government had spent the entire period of the lockdown arguing that the measures implemented to help combat the virus should be reversed. In early May, Simon Dolan, multi-millionaire tax exile who lives in Monaco and just so happens to be hard Brexit, got hard Brexit lawyer connected with the Vote Leave campaign, Francis Hoare, to fight the legality of the lockdown. Dolan had previously been trying to win a contract to supply the government with masks. His contract was turned down and he suddenly became a hardcore anti-masker and a critic of the lockdown, and also a downplayer of the effects of COVID. But reports are that he's often seen merrily wandering around Monaco wearing a mask. Anyway, This multi-millionaire crowd-funded this spurious case against the lockdown. Obviously, this case was thrown out, but not before Francis Hoare had pocketed nearly £70,000 of people's money. Interestingly, donors also produced films for Iconic. On the 22nd of May, it was reported that Dominic Cummings had breached the lockdown and had driven to Durham. The result of this was a total undermining of the policy, and we saw huge amounts of people flock to parks and beaches for the May bank holiday. It later turned out that Dominic Cummings shopped himself to the police and to the newspapers too, almost as if he wanted to undermine the lockdown. This actually became known as the Cummings effect. Public confidence in the UK's ability to handle the COVID-19 pandemic dropped sharply following the news that Dominic Cummings, senior aide to the Prime Minister, had seemingly broken lockdown rules, finds new analysis by UCL researchers. In August and September 2020, several anti-lockdown protests were put on in Trafalgar Square, and these were arranged with the help of John Mappin of Turning Point UK, which is a publicity arm of Koch Industries. It was also helped by the English Democrats, which are a racist hard Brexit group that contains Vernon Coleman, and the Church of Scientology, who happen to be heavy supporters of Donald Trump and the right-wing nexus. Pro-Brexiteers such as Andrew Tice and Simon Dolan also got involved. As an interesting aside, you actually need to get permission from the government to protest in Trafalgar Square, and this was arranged by a chap called John Carlton, a Scientologist who works with at least two other Scientologists on a 5G-run home automation project. One of these is a member of the UK House of Lords named Lord McNair, or as he's known in the tabloids, Lord Scientology. He's also friends with John Mappin, who is the head of Turning Point UK and a prominent QAnon promoter, who also runs Camelot TV. This is a media outlet that denies COVID exists. John Mappin somehow knew the infamous paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, and his details are in Jeffrey Epstein's infamous Little Black Book. So why are the Church of Scientology involved? Can you guess? Yes, that's right, it's money. It's just money. You see, they got a huge tax break from Trump, and so they are returning the favour for him and his party. And to a degree, the same can be said for all the Brexit types floating around. Simply put, they are running interference in the hope of being rewarded later. Simply, if they can undermine belief in COVID, say it's just the flu, or even that it doesn't exist, then all those people that died from COVID, they didn't die from COVID, which means that there's nothing to criticise Trump or Johnson or the UK or USA governments for. If people don't focus on the dead, then Johnson isn't responsible for those deaths. People have been trained to whinge about minor inconveniences to their own lives rather than to focus on the big picture and hold people to account. But it's difficult to hold the government to account for allowing hundreds of thousands of people to die from a virus when you have twats telling people that viruses themselves don't exist. In September, against the advice of the sage scientists, university students were sent back to campus. Cases soared, and these students were isolated in their halls of residence. Only remote lessons were possible, but at least the universities got their rent, hey? Strangely, schools like Eton resisted the return of their students. Also in September, the government released a letter published by a group of scientists including Sunitra Gupta, Carl Hennigan, Carol Sikora, Michael Yeadon, and others. They had been pushing for herd immunity since March, Gupta, Yeadon and Sikora repeating several times the lie that this had already been achieved and arguing that lockdowns were more detrimental than the virus. On the surface, this seemed to be very critical of the government, arguing that lockdowns were draconian. However, it soon became clear that this line of thought came directly from the UK Treasury, specifically a think tank called Economic Insight. These scientists were working alongside the UK Treasury, focusing on costs and not health. Furthermore, it was revealed that Gupta, Hennigan, Yeadon et al. Were also being promoted by the UK Behavioural Insight Group, the Nudge Unit, specifically through the PR firm Sergru Communications. It was the government promoting these herd immunity, anti-lockdown tropes. When shown to epidemiologists, the Economic Insight paper on COVID-19 deaths was described as pseudoscience, as the model or the premise didn't even stand up to the most basic scientific scrutiny. This was quite clever tactics by the UK government. They promoted with television, media and radio interviews a series of scientists who were on the surface very critical of the government strategy. The clever thing was that what these scientists recommended, herd immunity, was what the government was doing anyway on the sly. So this does three things. It makes it look like the government are actually responding to the public mood and not just being immovable in their decisions. Secondly, it brings the public round to their original unannounced plan. Yeah, why are they doing that? These scientists know what they're talking about, and that option, that sounds far less intrusive in my life. And thirdly, it means that whatever the government does and whatever happens, they have a group of advisors and scientists that they can blame. Also in September, Gupta, Sikora, Hennigan and the Swedish Anders Tegnell spoke at Downing Street to promote herd immunity. And after this meeting, against the advice of the sage scientists, the autumn circuit break lockdown was rejected. Around this time, for no apparent reason, Anders Tegnell warned that the UK really shouldn't try for herd immunity and that it wouldn't work. And not that he'd been doing this in Sweden, obviously, perish the thought. These were just thoughts, really, that just occurred to him. Following this, Boris Johnson repeatedly refused to impose measures on London. In October 2020, the Coke Industries financed AEIR promoted the Great Barrington Declaration, a conference and paper that promoted the idea of herd immunity. The Great Barrington Declaration was named after the town in which it was created and was drafted by Gupta and two other US scientists, Professor Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University and Stanford fellow Jay Bhattacharya. AEIR is an Atlas Network, oil industry and Coke Industries funded think tank that, among other things, promotes sweatshops as a good thing. One of the key authors was Alex Katyal. Alex Katyal is the partner of Sunitra Gupta. Alex Katyal also works for a firm called Animal Dynamics, who do classified research for the Ministry of Defence. Katyal's business partner in Animal Dynamics is William Mark Evans, formerly of Goldman Sachs and extensively connected to the oil industry. Patrick Fagan, who worked for Cambridge Analytica, is for some reason also part of the Great Barrington Declaration. Alongside Gupta, you have Dr. Carl Hennigan, also playing it down. Now, he's financed by this couple called the Willits, who are friends with Chris Burnham, who worked on the Trump transition team. They're also good friends with Mary Jacobi, who worked directly with the Reagan and Bush administrations. So, pro-Trump Republicans. Hennigan ends his posts. The article has not been peer-reviewed. It should not replace individual clinical judgment, and the sources cited should be checked. The views are not substitute for professional medical advice, and this is usually the most accurate part of the article. His stuff is published by The Spectator, which is owned by the Barclay brothers, who just so happen to be donors to the Conservative Party. Then there is Dr. Carol Sikora, who is up to his tits in the IEA, which is a think tank connected to Coke Industries and behind Brexit. And surprise to surprise, he wants to privatise the NHS, saying that it is the last bastion of communism in the world. In the past, he's worked for AstraZeneca and lied about being connected to Imperial College for some reason. He's quite the illustrious career, with being the Lockerbie bomber's doctor, the one who lied about his cancer diagnosis. Also in his career, he once gave a 14-year-old boy a mercy-killing lethal injection. He also has a record of lobbying on behalf of the Conservative Party. For instance, he founded the Doctors for Reform group, a free market pressure group which was accused in 2004 of being supported by the Conservative Party, according to British Medical Journal. In 2009, he was paid to appear in US adverts for the Republican Party created by a lobby group, Conservative for Patient Rights, which, among other things, spends its time attacking the NHS. Oh yeah. That is one thing that I haven't actually mentioned. These donors, specifically the ones connected to the IEA, the Cokes, Turning Point UK, and anyone connected to Brexit, they want to privatise the NHS, and they're not even shy about this. So herd immunity allows them to overwhelm the NHS and ensure that operation backlogs grow and grow. What solution might they offer? Well, colour me shocked if they don't offer American private businesses up to take up some of the slack from the poor, bedraggled NHS. This is privatisation by stealth, although it's not actually that stealthy. During this time, PCR claims came about. This is another group with Michael Yeadon as the figurehead. The point of this group is to criticise the PCR test, mostly with the idea that they give 90% false positives. This isn't true, they actually give 30% false negatives. Anyway, this is very easily disproven. If they gave 90% false positives, then we would see uniform levels of infection everywhere. Indeed, if they gave 90% false positives, we would never have any area where there was zero COVID. But we do, because Michael Yeadon is a liar. He was also exposed as being a horrible old racist, as loads of old tweets surfaced with him being a sad, nasty old bigot. Patrick Fagan of Cambridge Analytica fame is also, for some reason, involved in PCR claims. PCR claims also has links to the Conservative Party and to the government. One of his experts on economics is Geoffrey Peel, previously an area vice chair of the Conservative Party, a business spokesman for Vote Leave and the Northern Ireland chairman of the Brexit campaign group Business for Britain. He was also an advisor to the Department of International Trade from 2017 to 2020. The Great Barrington Declaration was also overseen by an advisory board called PANDA. On the board of PANDA were Patrick Fagan, Martin Kulldorff, and Donald Trump's former COVID advisor, Scott Atlas. PANDA is heavily opposed to vaccines, and it backs the discredited work of anti-vaccine doctor Dennis Rancor. In December 2020, having been kicked off Twitter for being a racist, Michael Yeadon started a Facebook news channel denying COVID and saying that the PCR tests are rubbish, called Unlocked United Kingdom. Yeadon was helped in this endeavour by Patrick Fagan of Cambridge Analytica fame. Unlocked's chairman and the director of Unlocked UK Limited is former Conservative Party donor turned Brexit Party MEP Ben Habib, who had previously been backing Yeadon's social media career. At Christmas, against the advice of the Sage Group, Boris Johnson suggested that Christmas bubbles were probably okay, allowing different groups to meet and mix, and following this, thousands died. In May 2021, Johnson refused to stop passengers from India coming to the UK via plane, and this was against the advice of Sage, who put India on a red list due to the new Indian variant, which later became known as the Delta variant. Now, this was partly because Johnson was trying to finalise a trade deal with Modi of India. Modi was also brought to power by Cambridge Analytica. Interestingly, as part of the trade deal, there will be freedom of movement between India and UK. During the entire debacle, we've seen a series of media outlets pouring scorn on the severity of the virus, picking at figures suggesting that tests don't work and hospitals aren't stretched, and these include Talk Radio, which is owned by the Murdochs, The Times, which is owned by Viscount Rothmere, The Telegraph and Spectator, which is owned by the Barclay brothers, The Mail, which is owned by the Norcliffes, The Lockdown Skeptics, which is owned by Toby Young, and Sky News Australia and Fox, which are also owned by the Murdoch Corporation. By massive coincidence, these are all people who donate to the Conservative Party and want you to go to work and earn them money. The anti-lockdown protests in the UK were put on by the Church of Scientology, backers of Trump, and Turning Point UK, which is Koch Industries. See, as I said before, in April 2020, for the first time, oil went into negative, meaning that due to a lack of demand, you had to pay to get rid of it, as opposed to the normal profit on every barrel. So the same people who just so happen to finance the Republicans in the USA and the Conservatives in the UK also have ties to this petrochemical industry. That's why the UK government resisted lockdown for 4 weeks. That's why they undermined it and finished it in May. That's why they sent the students back. That's why they introduced tiers rather than going into lockdown. That's why they continuously changed the rules and made them so stupid that most people didn't follow them anyway. That's why they pretended to oppose the government policy. It's all about money. That's why they never closed the borders or provided adequate facilities at airports. And to explain why the government is actually behind this series of media nodes and personalities that seem to be undermining the figures, the tests, the severity, etc., well, it's quite simple. If you doubt that the figure of 150,000 dead is accurate, then the government didn't do quite as badly as you thought. If we figure that they've inflated the deaths, then they didn't do as badly as it looks. And this is why the nudge unit has tricked people into providing the government with an alibi, when you should be holding them to task for their failures. On the 19th of May 2021, Dominic Cummings revealed before a select committee that herd immunity was definitely the UK government's strategy. At the same time, Boris Johnson refused to stop travel from India to the UK despite the country being on a red list, with the new variant being prevalent there. And this was because he was hoping for a trade deal with the Modi government. Modi, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump and Johnson, was elected with help from Cambridge Analytica. It was recently revealed that excess deaths in India for the year 2020 were over 4 million. The official death toll for COVID in India is 10 times less than this, and this is due to the way that deaths are recorded. A positive test and death in certain places such as hospitals is required to be added to the stats. Sadly, millions of people in India died of something, but a lack of tests means that the true toll can only be estimated. But reports do seem to indicate that the majority of those who died suffered from COVID prior to death. It was also revealed in court hearings held at the end of May that the government of Brazil also went for a policy of herd immunity. In an interview, Senator Renan Calheiros said, "It is too early to say if Bolsonaro had committed any criminal offence in his management of the public health crisis and that more investigation is required. But I think that everything points in that direction." Calheiros cited Bolsonaro's preference for herd immunity. The president first denied the disease, called it a flu, then argued against social isolation and lockdown. Then he played down the use of masks and encouraged crowds to gather. Why is that? Because of herd immunity, the natural immunity. You have to encourage crowds and the spread of the virus. Bolsonaro repeatedly stated on television and in the press that he believed that the vaccines would turn people into lizards. Thus far, this side effect has not been widely reported. In July 2021, with cases averaging 25,000 a day, the government announced that all safety measures were to be dropped on July the 19th, and this was against the advice of the sage scientists. They also stopped all requirements for masks and social distancing, even in crowded public places. On the 7th of July, the Daily Mail quietly printed an article saying that the UK government had decided to attempt to go for herd immunity in school children. The plan is for children to acquire natural immunity, which involves about 7 million children becoming infected. The need for entire classes to isolate in case of COVID was also scrapped. This is literally experimenting on children, hoping that they will catch it en masse and then just waiting to see what happens. This is not to mention the risk to teachers, to public transport staff, to local businesses and to the families of the children themselves. The headline was, "Herd immunity strategy is back." The media outlet Byline Times had been warning that this seemed to be the plan for a few days, having seen minutes from SAGE meetings explaining that their strategy was to attain natural immunity in school children. This was detailed in their article, "The Ghost of Herd Immunity Still Haunts Boris Johnson's Roadmap Out of Lockdown." Also on the 7th, another story in the Daily Mail explained that the decision to drop masks was not taken by scientists, but because that they felt masks indicated danger, and this put the public off from gathering, shopping and going to large events such as sporting events and nightclubs. To reiterate, they stopped masks because they felt it would harm the economy. The headline read, "Ministers scrapped masks to save the economy." On the 19th of July, Freedom Day, yeah! Robert Dingwall, a social scientist from the University of Nottingham, went on Newsnight to explain his theory that long COVID was psychosomatic. That's right, it was all in the mind. But this goes totally against all known scientific evidence that shows the long-term damage to the organs of the sufferers. It transpires that Dingwall, who advises the government, is a proponent of, you guessed it, herd immunity. On the 20th of July, Dominic Cummings was interviewed on the BBC. I have actually written a longer piece on this which can be found on my website, but here are the main points that were revealed. Laura Kunisberg. So, let's come on to COVID then. What was it like in Downing Street when you started to realise how serious this could be? Dominic Cummings. Well, it was obviously extremely frightening and also pretty surreal as well, because it feels like you're in a disaster movie, but it's not a disaster movie. It's actually real. And you're looking around the room at the different people who are in key positions and thinking, they're not the people that should be in charge in this sort of thing. Laura Kunisberg. As it's my job to talk to people on all sides of the political divide, I remember talking to you late February and you mentioned the government was starting to make serious plans. At that point, it didn't seem that the Prime Minister was particularly involved in this. Dominic Cummings. No, at that point, I remember even in, the first week of March, he was saying, business as usual and whatnot. He just didn't seem to take it seriously. Laura Kunisberg. And what was the atmosphere like then in Downing Street? He didn't take it seriously at all? Dominic Cummings. No, he didn't take it seriously. His view was, this is just like the swine flu. I've seen these kinds of scares over and over again. They're always nonsense. And his priorities and his concern were elsewhere. Laura Kunisberg. But there was a crystallisation when one of your team said, actually, the numbers look much worse than we think. Basically, the government scientists' projections were wrong. Was that what it was like? Dominic Cummings, a very, very smart physicist who was helping the NHS with data, came to me and said, it doesn't seem to me this plan's been thought out. Has this really been properly checked? This whole herd immunity plan, it's like a massive call. And are you okay if I go around and look for some people to talk to and think about looking for a plan B? And I said, yeah, definitely do. As the days ticked on from there, it was increasingly clear that the official plan was going to be a disaster. And it was me and a few other people. Essentially, it was me saying to the Prime Minister, vital elements of the system have got this totally wrong. There is some kind of terrible bureaucratic fog and confusion, which means that people are not looking at the right numbers. Essentially, we'd said to him, the official plan is a disaster and we can't do it. And if we do, it could kill 500,000 people. The main thing to take away from this is that the UK government, as early as February 2020, had already decided, against the advice of the science, to go for a strategy of herd immunity, and that is to allow people to acquire natural immunity from getting the disease. The interview continued. Laura Kunisberg. Let's talk now about the next phase of the pandemic. So through the summer, the country was very significantly opened up. Cases had gone down again, and then at the start of the autumn through September, they started to tick up again. It appeared that the virus wasn't done with us. What was your attitude at the time to what was going on? Dominic Cummings. Well, a fundamental problem was that in summer, the Prime Minister's attitude was that essentially the first lockdown was a disaster and that we should never have done it. Laura Kunisberg. He thought we should have never have done the first lockdown? Dominic Cummings. He said we should never have done the first lockdown. He said that repeatedly in meetings in number 10. After the first wave passed, and after he came back to work, initially his view was essentially, thank goodness we did do that, but very quickly, as the Telegraph and various parts of the media and Tory party started screaming, he then basically reverted and said, actually, the whole thing was a disaster, we should never have done it. I was right in February, we should basically just ignore it and just let the thing wash through the country and not destroy the economy and move on. Okay, aside from the herd immunity angle, the important takeaway is that Johnson reacted to the Telegraph. More on that later. He has no long-term plan, he's simply trying to appease the donors to his party. The Telegraph is not only owned by donors to the party, but it's a representation of their values. And you know what they find the most value in? Money. The interview continued. Dominic Cummings. When you get to the week of about 15th to the 19th of September, by that point the data was clear about what was happening, and Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty came to Downing Street and said, it's clear where this is going, and we think that you should consider hitting it hard and early. And the Prime Minister said, No, 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 I'm not doing it. Laura Kunisberg, but to be completely clear about what you're saying, that by the middle of September, you, Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, and other people in the government are trying to push Boris Johnson to bring back restrictions, and you're saying that he was refusing? Dominic Cummings, essentially yes it was, but it was because a combination of Starmer had said that it should happen, and therefore the Prime Minister felt it would be politically disastrous just for him to suddenly admit that Starmer had been right. Secondly, he had a bunch of Tory MPs screaming at him. Remember, some of those Tory MPs, similar to the ones on Brexit, had lost their minds and were saying all kinds of complete fake news about COVID. And third, he had the Telegraph, who he always referred to as, quote, my real boss, unquote. So he had those three things all pushing him not to act. Laura Kunisberg, sorry, the Prime Minister calls the Telegraph his real boss? You've just said, what evidence do you have for this? Dominic Cummings, yes, and the Telegraph was extremely hostile to do anything. Laura Kunisberg, so are you suggesting that the Prime Minister of this country calls the Telegraph newspaper that he used to be a columnist for, he calls them his real boss? Okay, this again is the clearest indication of the reality of the situation. It wasn't about lockdowns, it wasn't about some grandiose plan to put microchips in people, it wasn't about faking a virus, it was about money. Johnson is right to call the Telegraph his real boss. It is on two levels. As I said before, it's owned by the Tory donors, but much more importantly, it reflects the attitudes of Tory donors and the architects of the party. He had no plan. There is no grand plot. There is just a corrupt government who did not want to upset their donors and didn't care what happened to the rest of us. Simple. When forced into a 4-week lockdown in November, which was then diluted by zones before being eventually lifted and then hastily reinforced over Christmas, Johnson swore that this would be the last time he declared such actions. Was this because he was concerned with the effects of the lockdown on the population? No, not even close. It was about appeasing his donors. Johnson was reported to have said, "No more fucking lockdowns. Let the bodies pile high in their thousands." Laura Kunisberg, so do you think that Boris Johnson was therefore putting politics ahead of people's lives? Dominic Cummings, certainly he did. He put his own political interests ahead of people's lives, for sure.